Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the IISS. My name is Stephen Simon. I'm the Executive Director here in Washington and in our Middle East office. I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Emile Hokayem, very quickly because I imagine that discussion will be quite intense given the nature of the subject. Emile is here, as you know, to discuss his new Adelphi book, his IISS Adelphi book, Syria's Uprising and the Fracturing of the Levant. It explores both the internal dynamics of the Syrian crisis as well as the regional competition that's shaping up over the country's future. While writing the book, Emile traveled regularly to Syria and the region. He met with senior Assad associates, rebel commanders, fighters, opposition leaders in exile, Western, Turkish, and Arab government officials, and a variety of humanitarian and international leaders. He has truly made the rounds and is an authority on the subject at hand. He is now our senior fellow for regional security at the IISS Middle East. Prior to joining the Institute, some of you, at any rate, might have been familiar with Emile's writings through The National, where he was the international affairs columnist and political editor based in Abu Dhabi. Before that, he was at the Henry Stimson Center here in Washington, and before that at Georgetown, where he did his academic work. Emile will speak, well, essentially for as long as he wishes to speak, but probably for 10 or 15 minutes, something like that, and then we will open the floor up to Q&A. Emile, over to you.
Good morning to all. Well, it's a pleasure, always a pleasure to be back in DC. I have to say, given the heat and humidity today, I would have much preferred to be in the Gulf. First, I mean, there's a number of people who work on Syria in this room and have great insights. And you know, the work on Syria is really a call for sobriety and humility. I mean, what we've seen in the past 2 years was certainly stunning, but analytically very challenging. You know, the rise of new dynamics, new actors, etc. I mean, from a personal perspective, researching the book and other writings, in the process of that, you build so many contacts that only last a few months because they disappear, because they become refugees, or they're killed, or their calculations change, etc. Even travel inside Syria, it's just you have to be very humble about what you see. You witness some events, dynamics, but there is a real danger of extrapolating or overstating what you witness on the ground, because things shift very quickly. And there are large parts of Syria that we knew nothing about, up until the uprising. That analysts, journalists, many people just never really paid attention to eastern Syria or some other Idlib, or it's just we're just discovering that country, that beautiful and now war-torn country. But really, I mean, at the end of the day, it's really a call for analytical sobriety. This book is not a piece of advocacy, and I hope it's just a fair and rigorous assessment of the dynamics inside Syria and the opposition. A look at the regime's calculation and strategy, and the regional dynamics that influence and are influenced by what's happening inside Syria. I hope I'll do the same. Provide some a sober and rigorous assessment in this presentation. I know a number of you would want to talk about U.S. policy, arming, not arming, Ahmed al-Asir, Lebanon, Jabhat al-Nusra, etc. I'll do this in the Q&A mostly. I'll leave that for the Q&A. my first point is that we always looked at Syria, I would argue, in a wrong way, especially from this time. For a very long time, the debate in the West, and much of the Arab world, to be honest, was about engagement or isolation of Syria. We focused on regime dynamics, we focused on the regime's regional policies, etc. But in reality, Syria's power, and in the process of that, I think we exaggerated the power of Syria as a state. Syria's intrinsic power was always exaggerated as a state. It's not a country that has massive attributes of power, objective attributes of power, in terms of resources, industrial base, in terms of alliances, even there's human potential, human talent, but that was really constrained by the regime's policies. So if you compare Syria to the two other countries that had the same self-image and had the same ambitions in the region, Egypt and Iraq to some extent, Syria really paled in comparison. So statecraft was the key issue. Like the ability to muster whatever Syria can muster to make itself relevant on the regional scene. And this is where the genius of, in a way, Hafez al-Assad kicked in, is that he turned Syria's geography into an asset. It was a weakness. Syria was historically, the short history as a coherent entity, was a weak state, and Assad managed to make the most out of that, implicating himself everywhere. I would argue that since March 2011, this is no longer the case. We're back to in a way, the real Syria, a weak state, rife with internal contradictions, internal divides. That's really looking around, for possible patrons and foreign help, etc. I don't want to push the analogy too much, but it's not too dissimilar from what Lebanon is in a way. But again, I don't want to push the analogy too much. Another issue is that Assad's risk profile before the uprising was always, I think, I would say, misjudged. This is someone who actually embarked on a number of ventures that made sense from the perspective of his own interests, but always seemed to stun observers. And for me, the key element here, not necessarily the support for jihadis in Iraq or all that stuff, or possible implication in the murder of Hariri and other issues. It's really the Kibar reactor, the nuclear reactor. Again, I don't want to overdo it. I think Assad did it in a very opportunistic way. But there was a sense for a long time that he didn't have the resources, he didn't have the talent, and he didn't have the risk profile to do something like that. Well, he did it, and it was destroyed in September 2007, and then 2 months later, he's invited in Annapolis. So in a way, there was no really, there was never a reckoning, never a hard look at this. Another issue that relates to what I said earlier is the relationship between Syria and Iran. There was always an emphasis on the fact that these two countries were very dissimilar, so therefore it was an alliance of convenience. I think that was always the wrong way of looking at it. I would argue it was an arranged marriage in which the two partners ended up falling in love. It's not, we look at it and, we emphasize the differences when we don't realize that the two countries had the same interests in terms of a new regional order, in terms of frustrating the interests of others. But it was not necessarily a negative agenda from their perspective. They had a preference for a different kind of regional order, and they put everything they could in that one. They invested very heavily. I would argue that Bashar did this largely at first out of a need for legitimacy, domestic and regional, and especially in his alliance with Hezbollah, which is one of the three pillars of this. But over time, I would argue, and we had this debate with a couple of people in the room over time. I would argue that Assad became a junior member in this alliance. I'm very reluctant to embrace this discourse that's starting. I mean, of course, Assad tried to diversify his relationship, in second half of the previous decade, but it had no decisive impact on his strategic positioning in the region. Now, while we looked at all this, what we missed out are two very important things. The first one is the decay of the Syrian state. And in a way, it's much easier and more pleasant to hang out in Damascus than other places in Syria. But in reality, the withdrawal from the state and some of the public policy choices, some of the public investment choices, etc., really point to a shift in attention and focus from the periphery to the main cities. And this came alongside another key shift, which is a shift in constituencies. Basically, to put it simply, Hafez al-Assad used the periphery to control the cities. Bashar won the cities and left the periphery behind. And I think it's not an accident, not a surprise, that Daraa and Idlib, the first two places where the uprising really gathered steam, Daraa and Idlib were historically the prime providers of recruits to the Ba'ath Party and the military. But this is where the uprising started the earliest and in the hardest way. These were two places that used to be pillars of the regime, and that shift points to a lot of dynamics that happened. I mean, economic, social dynamics that really changed Syria since the mid-90s, but even more so since Bashar came to power. Another point, this one, and I always remember then Senator Kerry, today Secretary of State Kerry at Carnegie Endowment on March 16, 2011, talking about his confidence in Assad, that Assad knows what's happening. It's a secular country. The roadmap is there. He's made the hard choices. I mean, a pretty interesting statement to look back in retrospect. And that was, we always either describe Syria as secular, or today we're going to the other extreme and we only portray it as sectarian Alawite. It shows, I would say, a lack of understanding of Syria, in the sense that the real word you want to use here is asabiya, kinship, group solidarity. It has elements of secularism in it and of sectarianism, but it helps explain the current dynamics a lot more. I still think the best book on Syria is one written in French in 1985 by Michel Seurat called Syrie, l'état de barbarie. Don't read anything else on Syria. If you can read something, it was written 30 years ago, and the relevance of that research to today's dynamics is just stunning. Michel Seurat, for the record, was actually kidnapped by Hezbollah for writing this book at the Order of Syrians, and his remains were found 20 years later somewhere. Still the best work on Syria. Now, let's make it a bit more relevant to today's Syria. Well, first I would argue that Syria has already overtaken Iraq, the Iraq War, in humanitarian, regional, and strategic terms. Sometimes difficult for Western audiences to accept this, because the debate over Iraq was so toxic and so fundamental to the politics of the US, the UK, other countries, because of the human, financial, political cost of this adventure, etc. But from a Middle East Levantine perspective, Syria is having already, after 2 years, is having a much bigger impact. I'm not going to spend too much on the humanitarian dislocation, although this is massive. I'm thinking Lebanon is what, one-fifth of the population today is constituted of Syrian refugees. We saw what, the repercussions in Jordan, in Turkey, other places. But in regional and strategic terms, there's absolutely no doubt that Syria is much bigger than Iraq. In a way, in Iraq, the US occupation, which was the catalyst for the violence, was also the only constant in that equation. All the Iraqi actors basically calculated or positioned themselves based on their perception of what the Americans would do, on their calculations about levels of troops and policy, etc. In Syria, I would argue we're already in a state of almost free-for-all. There is no constant in that equation. All the fault lines that crossed the Arab world and existed in Iraq expressed themselves much more potently and more powerfully in Syria than elsewhere. The state-society fracture line, fault line, the Gulf Iran, the Sunni Shia, the various forms of political Islam, the struggle of political Islam against secularists and minorities, and even the issue of ethnic separatism. It's important to look at all this and realize it's really in Syria where it's playing out the hardest. So, Iraq is, as I said, Syria, as I said, is shaping the Levant and the broader Middle East in ways that Iraq never did. And today it's important to look at Lebanon and Iraq as part of the geography of the conflict. Forget those borders. Actually, I think these have become abstract borders in the head of many of the fighters on both sides. I think the military in Iraq is certainly more powerful than the one in Lebanon, but a strict security containment strategy is going to fail because of the nature of those areas, the regions, the strengths of transnational links, and so on. The regional powers have also equated the unfolding and the outcome of the struggle in Syria with their own regional influence and standing. I think a number of the key countries in the region see it as a zero-sum game, and the discourse, from the Qataris today, Saud al-Faisal, and others really point to that. So, contrary to the Lebanese civil war, where the game in a way was contained within the parameters, there's no victor, no vanquished formula here. I think it's a fight to death. Now, instead of offering a comprehensive state of play of what's happening inside Syria today, I prefer to outline some of the key asymmetries that I think explain why we are where we are today, the state of stalemate with some regime gains in some places and some rebel gains in others. First, there's an asymmetry in goals between the two sides, and of course, when I say the two sides, I keep in mind that the rebellion is very fragmented. And just for the purpose of the talk, I'll say the rebels. The first asymmetry is in goals. We know that for Assad, the goal is to survive in key places, and he's playing defense in most of those places, which is a much easier game to play. For the rebels, it's really about winning territory and winning and conquering key cities, without which they will never be taken seriously as potential rulers of the country. And I would argue that in this asymmetry, Assad has done a pretty good job in recent times. I'll get to that a bit later. There's a difference in narrative. Assad is offering a very, I would say, segmented messaging. He's addressing different communities in different ways. He's giving, different segments of his supporters different reasons to support him. So people, the core cares about, the survival of the Alawite power or preventing retribution, etc. The minorities worry about the sea of Sunnis. That's how they put it. A number of urbanites, including many Sunnis, care about the continuity of the state, or care about no reversal to bad economic policies, or losing their assets, etc. And Assad is able to message those different constituencies very well. Here, what the rebels like is actually a unifying message. So the problem of the rebels is that they're very good at messaging very locally for very short periods of time. But what they need to be taken seriously is a unified message. So Assad, what he needs is a fragmented message or segmented message, very specialized depending on the constituency. The rebels is the very opposite. They need a unifying message to get more people mobilized. Another asymmetry is in the mobilization, and it relates directly to the point I made before. All what Assad had to do was to mobilize his core, which he did, and then he can live with vast segment of Syrian society retreating in denial, dejection, survival mode, neutrality, whatever. As long as they don't join the other side, he's fine. For the rebels, the game is to expand their constituency, expand their appeal. And I would argue they failed at this pretty strongly in the past year. First, the biggest strategic mistake up until today remains the attack on Aleppo, the attempt to take Aleppo, which has really sharpened all those divides. Aleppo is Syria's largest city. There was a strategic case from a rebel perspective to take Aleppo. That created a continuity between the Turkish border and the largest city in Syria. You make a claim for that would become your liberated capital. It's how we can develop this. The reality is that the rebels never went in with a strategy, never went in by talking to the key constituencies before. I mean, those of us who follow Syria closely remember that in May, June 2012, Aleppo was rising. There were demonstrations in universities, lawyers, judges, etc., doctors. And then the rebels go in and nothing happens. There is no welcoming from the city, which shows that there's a lot of unresolved tensions there that actually have been sharpened by this move. So the Assad, as long as he's mobilized his core, is fine with many Syrians just looking inwards, not being politically active, not even having to demonstrate their loyalty to him. Which take us to another point. An asymmetry in, say, nature or organization. To survive, Assad had to transform his government into a militia. You may say that it was always a militia, and that we always fooled ourselves into thinking it was a state or government. That certainly is my opinion, but I'll take the challenge. Well, the rebels, for them, is to actually avoid being militias. Assad, to survive, has to become a militia, and he has become one, and he's behaving as a warlord, essentially. But the rebels, to win, have to do the very opposite thing. They have to avoid turning into militias, and they have to coalesce more. And at this game, Assad is much better. He has more experience, and there's a core ethos among his supporters that allows him to do that shift. The tensions that we see in rebel-held areas between civilian combatants, civilians, defectors, etc., are a sign of how difficult it is to transform. There's an asymmetry in military power. I mean, we know the numbers. Assad remains the strongest military power on the ground. Let's not kid ourselves. He can deploy troops. He still can make decisions about allocation of resources. He decides which areas to conquer, retake, which ones to abandon, which ones to pummel, etc. And he can dedicate the resources he wants. What he cannot do, and I'll get this to this point at the end of my talk, is reconquer the country or mount a counterinsurgency campaign that has a soft side to it to regain the loyalty of his population. He has limited resources, and he's not going to waste that money trying to win the hearts of the people again. He's just going to make sure that he provides enough order so that people can go about surviving on their own, but he's not necessarily going to try to win them over with large projects. We see some of this on Syrian television, some efforts to win the hearts. It's Potemkin projects, not much more. But in terms of military power, Assad has proven able to adapt very quickly, in fact, in 2 years. I argue that his conventional forces were always a bad tool for him to deal with a massive uprising. Actually, the army was not designed to deal with a popular uprising because they never imagined it would be so massive and broad-based. The intelligence and security services were also focused on controlling the population, but they were primarily geared at preventing challenges from within the security elite, from not really the kind of uprising they had to deal with in the past 2 years. But again, Assad has proven adaptable here. The kind of changes we've seen in the armed forces in the past 6 to 9 months show that there is a learning curve. That younger commanders are being promoted, tactics are changing on the ground. There's better integration of foreign expertise, etc. We'll get to. The rebels, however, are militarily not there. Not just in terms of equipment, which is probably what most people in this town think about, but also in terms of tactic and strategy. The rebels don't really know right now what kind of war they're fighting. Of course, at the most basic level, they worry about communal self-defense. They protect their villages, their towns. It's driven by fear, by bravado very often. It's often very clumsy. It's often, when they win a battle, they don't know if it was a tactical win or strategic win, and they overstate the important. I mean, anyone who has spent any time with these guys, there's a strategic fog, when it comes to the armed battle. And this, by the way, we can go back to Aleppo, which is the example I gave earlier. Before Aleppo, I think the rebel strategy was pretty smart. You go after bases around the country. You go after supply lines. You exhaust the military, etc. But you don't attack the main cities that are so well defended that the regime has spent 40 years securing, etc. I would argue at this point the rebels don't really know what war. Is it a conventional war? Is it primarily urban warfare? Well, if it's conventional war, they can't win it. Assad still has more resources. There's another asymmetry, one in local administration. Basically, Assad and the regime have, in a way, nothing to prove, and they don't really care about local administration. What they primarily provide is security, stability, order in where they are, which allows people to go about the business of surviving or figuring out how you operate in such a chaotic existence. Of course, the regime continues to pay salaries in the regions it controls, and in the region it doesn't control, sometimes it's paid salaries, like the electrical plant on the dam west of Raqqa, which is very important because they also need that electricity. There are places where the regime still spends money left and right to remain relevant, but in many places the regime has withdrawn. Whereas the rebels have everything to prove in terms of local administration, and I would argue they're not doing a very good job at it. They don't have the resources, they don't have the local organization. It's been, there's some successful models, perhaps that can be built on by foreign providers, helpers, etc. But they're not there yet. Another asymmetry, key asymmetry here is the one in non-state actor support. Basically, if Hezbollah is on your side, Hezbollah provides muscle, discipline, expertise, and experience. These are the guys who are not on your side. On the other side, you get foreign fighters. You are, jihadi in nature, perhaps muscle, but not very disciplined, have very different goals, visions, but not really forces that are easy to integrate into your own military strategy. And that has shown where Hezbollah is deployed, it wins. Another asymmetry, and in just a minute, is one in regional support. Basically, the Gulf states provide money and weapons. Iran provides money, weapons, skilled personnel, expertise, and strategic patience. A cheeky way to put it, we're discussing this with a friend a week ago, is that if you have to choose between Qasem Soleimani, the head of the RGC, and one of the Saudi or Qatari princes doing the fight, who are you going to follow in the battle? Qasem Soleimani is a smart fighter. He fought in the 80s against Iraq. He trained operatives in the 90s. He was involved and did a pretty good job in Iraq and Afghanistan the previous decade. He gets it. He gets the nature of the fight, and they're in it. They know what their objectives are. They're invested in it, and they're tough the way they have to be tough in that fight. The Saudi and Qatari princes, I suspect, would rather spend their time in London or some other nice spot rather than actually lead that fight. And I'm not sure they're actually on the ground, just getting it, understanding how this is fun. And at this level, I would argue that Syria has really exposed the limitation of the Gulf states. They don't have the expertise, and they don't have the strategy, and they don't have the strategic patience. This long game is going to be very key. My final point has to do with the international foreign element. I would argue that Russia is in the trenches with Assad, whereas Washington, well, it's probably, I would have said until a few days ago, is pulling from behind. Perhaps it has, let go a bit more and is trying to, really take the game seriously. But there is a big asymmetry at that level. And perhaps, I think we often misunderstand the Russian calculations. And, I urge you to read the article by our friend, our colleague, Sam Sharap on Russia's calculations vis-a-vis Syria. But certainly this perception is shaping the calculation of many of the local actors, the different levels of commitments and involvement. And finally, I would argue that in terms of diplomacy and if ever Geneva happens, Russia has more leverage over Assad than the US has over the opposition and the rebels. It doesn't mean that the leverage that Russia has over Assad is going to be decisive in any way. I don't think that if Bashar al-Assad is ever on the receiving end of a call by Putin telling him, please step down, he's going to do it. But that asymmetry is actually shaping a lot of the international diplomacy, and we would be foolish not to take this seriously. I mean, not a single rebel commander came out publicly in favor of Geneva after John Kerry and Putin and Lavrov agreed on it, and it tells you a story about the level of mistrust and confusion between the guys on that side. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A. I'll call on people, but if you identify yourself in your affiliation, it would help a lot. Thank you very much, sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Steve. Emile, when you talk, you didn't say a word about Israel. How does the Israeli look at this conflict? Two, when you look at the rebels, they have two main bases, in Jordan and in Turkey. And both these countries are very close allies of the US. So the notion that we don't have much influence on the rebels, I would disagree with, because the rebels are getting their money from our allies, getting their training and weapons through states that are close to us.
Sure. First on Israel, I think for a long time Israel loved dealing with Bashar al-Assad and this regime because it was weak and easy to deter. I mean, you could fly F-16s, go destroy a nuclear reactor, come out, and nothing would happen. I mean, this is the kind of ally you want in the region. You know, the military balance was very clear. You know, there was a kind of predictability, strategic certainty in this equation. I think Israel today is probably very. I mean, we're getting to a position that is in a way the worst of all worlds, where you have a weakened Assad that is increasingly dependent on Syria and Iran, alongside a variety of groups ranging from moderate to the most rebel ones operating all around the country, whose risk profile you don't know and that are difficult to contain, deter, etc. And you don't necessarily have the tools, the levers to do it. I mean, I think in typical Israeli fashion, the preferred approach is to retreat and say, you know what, we're still military superior, and we can do our intelligence work just around the Golan Heights, and let's play the game this way. Not really thinking, long term, thinking about what can be done. In a way, the Israelis, I would argue today, are most concerned about Jordan. And are very closely coordinating with Jordan on key issues, intelligence, missile defense, air defense, etc. But the Israelis don't seem to have an agenda of their own, or necessarily like a preferred outcome. And to give them credit, they also don't. They know they don't have the tools or any of the credibility to be shaping, whatever comes out. So Israel is pretty much, I would say, in a waiting mode, but really building the intelligence and picture to deal with, the volatility that's coming up. The issue on Jordan and Turkey, the relations with rebels and U.S. influence working through that. I take your point, but as long as there's no perception on the rebel side, but clear U.S. strategy and commitment, that influence is cheap currency. I mean, there's not much to get out of. Yes, I'm sure there's tactical cooperation, and rebels are working with Americans and others on identifying sensitive sites and perhaps constraining here and there. But I don't get the sense that first. I don't think that Qatar or Turkey own any rebel group, to be fully honest. I think we make the mistake of thinking that short-term support somehow translates into ownership of something. I doubt that someone in Turkey can pick up the phone and order a specific operation, or don't attack this town, or don't withdraw from that one. I still think it will take decisive U.S. involvement to turn those relationships in something more durable and something that can have an impact, militarily, but also politically down the road if there is to be a negotiated settlement.
Do we have a question from the back of the room, Mr. McVeigh?
Yeah.
Ken Meyercourt, World Docs. A year or so ago, the co-founder of Doctors Without Borders, who worked at a rebel-controlled hospital in Syria, claimed that half of his patients were foreigners, non-Syrians. Since that time, I think the flow of foreigners into the rebel forces has increased, and there seem to be some of the best fighters. Do non-Syrians have a role in terms of these opposition fighters, have a role in any political discussion about a solution to the problem?
I mean, the presence of foreign fighters is a very sexy, trendy topic, but I'm still reluctant to believe that they play a decisive role in the dynamics of Syria. Syrians accept them because they're very opportunistic, because those foreign fighters bring skills, they bring muscle, sometimes they bring a sense of dynamism and identity to the fight, etc. But I don't think it's necessarily a full ideological embrace that's happening. I'm also, I don't think that fighters constitute anywhere half, the total number of fighters. If anything, it's like 5–10%, and that's 10% being a very high estimate, in my opinion. Foreign fighters bring a number of skills, including self-promotion skills. These guys are there to publicize their fight. They're there to inspire and motivate at home. They're a lot more present in the media, on YouTube, etc., because they put a premium on that. Not like the Syrians, who are mostly focused on talking to domestic constituencies and don't necessarily have time to produce all these YouTube videos and claim credit for some messianic victory. Do they have a role in political negotiation? The question is whether Syrian society will give them a role, or whether there will be a pushback against those elements. The kid, I forgot his name, was killed shot in the head in Aleppo 3 weeks ago, was killed by 3 foreign fighters. Of course, in the punditry, a lot of people focus on the fact that some 3 nasty foreign fighters went and shot a kid, so that shows how radical the opposition is. Where the real story is the pushback from society, saying, these guys are criminal, and so we saw the demonstration mobilization in Aleppo. That, for me, is as important as shooting that poor kid in the head for alleged blasphemy. The key question here, there is another element to it. The number of foreign fighters in Syria today dwarfs by, in several, a factor of several. I'm sorry, I can't find the words here. There are many more foreign fighters in Syria today, perhaps not at any one point, than there were in Iraq, if you look at the numbers. And this is going to become a key security issue for a number of countries, including the Gulf states. A Saudi official that I talked to a week ago said they have the name of 940 Saudis who have served, who have been to Syria at any one point. Sure enough, some of these guys will chicken out, some of these guys will play a role in logistics rather than fighting. Those fighters are not necessarily on the front line all the time. But these are much greater numbers than what we know happened in Iraq. Around 270 French for that. I've read that. I've seen that number from French. The French Ministry. Pardon? Yes. Postmodern.
You.
Okay.
Here it is.
Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. I look forward to reading your book. The war is spreading in Lebanon now. We see these clashes inside, and a lot of people, including people in this room, have warned that Lebanon may be about to explode again. So I guess the question is, at what point do some of the outside actors in this try to at least curtail the spread? And I'm thinking here, you do have a new president coming in Iran who has very good relations with the Saudis, who negotiated the security agreement with them in 1998 after Khobar Towers. Do you see any moves outside this Geneva process, which looks increasingly feckless, on the part of actors like the Saudis, the Iranians, to try to at least contain the fighting in Syria?
First, on the issue of Iran, I mean, there are a number of Iran specialists in the back. There's a tall guy who used to work for me. I think Iran made a commitment to the survival of Assad, and has doubled down. I doubt that Rouhani, even if he has other priorities, is going to be able to steer Iran's policy away from that. I also think that Iran actually, if you look at history, Iran does well in countries undergoing civil strife. Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan are a good example of that. And what's the upside for Iran to really contain the dynamics in Lebanon? Now you suggest that perhaps a Iran-Saudi entente may lead to this. Here's where actually, a couple of words on Lebanon. I think in Lebanon, the mainstream factions realize that there's nothing to win from a civil war. That the investment and the cost would be huge, the fight would be very nasty sectarian, even Hezbollah would struggle to occupy other places. Actually, I would argue, and we see this in Saida, Hezbollah has become much more dependent on the Lebanese army because it has so many missions to accomplish. It has to man the border with Israel, it has to fight in Syria, it has to secure supply lines, etc. So if you need to go after the internal enemy, turn to the Lebanese army, they'll do the dirty job for you. But in a way, the mainstream factions accept that. The problem is that this creates a lot of room for spoilers, and we saw that with Ahmed al-Asir, the crazy guy inside Al-Qas, a quasi-Salafi cleric who has become a media star, and this is why Lebanon is so vulnerable. To be honest, I don't think the international community has the tools to really contain or shape a better outcome in Lebanon at this point. That train has already left the station. I think it's easier to contain the repercussions in Jordan, and where you have a much stronger security sector, where injection of money or energy assistance and where it does make a difference. In Lebanon, I think that it's really going to be up to the local actors to contain their own streets. Of course, foreign help will contribute to this, but I don't see a short-term, Iranian interest in, just getting to a settlement in Lebanon. It will be all very tactical. It will be all very momentary, and I think Hezbollah will make those calls rather than Tehran. Hezbollah, owns its territory. It controls its relation with all these actors. So it's in the short to medium term. I think Iran is not the key player here. Iran is much more geared towards what's happening inside Syria and how to, preserve this regime.
Hi, Emile. Thanks very much for your presentation. I agree with you on your assessment of the. Sorry, Andrew Taylor from the Washington Institute. I agree with you on your assessment of the foreign fighter role. They're present, but they're obviously not the majority in the opposition. But one group, or groups relatively close to them, and on various levels that we can get into, or you can get into, particularly Salafists, have grown in influence in a number of areas of Syria that I've seen and others have seen. I wonder how you look at that, and how do you estimate their numbers politically and militarily among the opposition as it stands right now? Thank you.
Very, very good point. For the past year and a half, we all, Jabhat al-Nusra was the one word that came to mind, etc. And I've argued over time that Jabhat al-Nusra is a less relevant actor in Syria than people make it to be. When it emerged a year and a half ago and so on, we all thought Jabhat al-Nusra would be a vanguard group. Special forces, shock troops, they show up when a base is besieged, but it's, you know, the rebels are not able to do it. They send 300 fighters, they win the day, they produce the video, they claim credit, everybody talks about them. Well, it worked, but it probably worked too well in the sense that Jabhat al-Nusra started growing very quickly, lost its ideological coherence. It was struggling, you know, what are we for? Global jihad, local governance, how do you relate to local groups? Do we accept foreigners? Do we accept Syrians? You know, and the Syrians, do we accept, do they have to be 100% certified Salafis to be in? It turned into a franchise. And in reality, in the past few months, you know, I would argue Jabhat al-Nusra has weakened. I mean, we see there is a big debate between al-Baghdadi, the head of ISI, Islamic State in Iraq, and al-Golani, the Syrian head of Jabhat al-Nusra, who has actually been weakened. And, you know, most of the foreign fighters and the hardcore fighters, this is what I understand, have actually moved to support al-Baghdadi rather than Golani. And what happened in the process is that you had the emergence of more coherent Salafi groups, especially IISS-US, Suqur-Shem to a lesser degree, but IISS-US is the big Salafi group I follow now. I think they're much more relevant, they're more homogeneous, they have better links to local society, local culture. They're not, I mean, they're Islamists and, you know, pretty hardline, but they don't have this, you know, messianic approach to everything, and they don't inscribe the Syrian struggle necessarily in, you know, a much broader, you know, struggle against all Shias everywhere all the time, and, you know, next chapter is Iraq. IISS is still a bit more nationalist in its ideology and its messaging, and actually, you know, the Syrian Islamic Front, and, you know, your colleague Aaron Zelen has done very good work on this and so on. The Syrian Islamic Front today is, you know, a prime military and political actor because of IISS largely. I mean, they cooperate with Tawheed, a couple of other groups as well. But it's a good story about how quickly dynamics change inside Syria. In December, when the US listed Jabhat al-Nusra as the key group, I mean, everybody freaked out. And then a couple months later, it's like, well, these guys, I mean, you know, IISS has really emerged as a much more important actor on that scene. And the thing is that when you talk to Syrian commanders and others, they don't say that they lack manpower. You know, they say they lack weapons, they lack strategy, etc. They don't lack manpower. And what they lack is specialized manpower for very specific missions, etc. The other point here is that the IISS has shown some of the terrorist tactics that, you know, Jabhat al-Nusra behaved differently depending on where it was. In Aleppo, it did some pretty awful things early on, but then became more interested in local governance and would send, you know, suicide bombs to Damascus. IISS seems to have a better, more coherent approach and tactics across the country, which makes them a more credible actor.
Sir?
I'll stand up and use my big voice. Chris Bidwell from the Federation of American Scientists. Emile, thank you. Great presentation. My question is this. With regards to Iran and Hezbollah and Assad himself, how long can they afford to keep going? What are the finances behind this battle? Are they running lower on income? Have they got enough to go the distance? Have you done any thinking on that subject? Thank you.
Well, the issue of resources is key, and I would argue that in a way Assad has, the shift to a war economy has benefited Assad in the short term. I mean, now that the pound is, you know, crashing and so on, I mean, some of these issues are different, but basically what happened is that a lot of services that the state used to provide for free or were subsidized, etc., as Syrians turn into survival mode, they almost accept that they're going to have to pay for a number of these services. The second thing is that Assad has withdrawn from a lot of regions, and basically these are resources he can redirect elsewhere. This is why I don't think Assad will go to Raqqa. I mean, there's no strategic point in taking one of the smallest cities in Syria, where you're going to have to spend resources, take them over, and then resources to rebuild local governance, etc. You know, let them be on their own. It's a total containment strategy at that level. So Assad has redirected his resources, and he has, I mean, in terms of military strategy, for instance, the reliance on local groups is also a matter of finances. It costs less to have, you know, groups providing for their own local security and defense, and then you use the conventional army or your special forces, etc., as expeditionary forces. You deploy them when you want them, etc. So that shift also it's all reallocation of resources, and that explains, you know, that's one of the factors that explains his resilience and continued survival. Now on Iran, I think you know, if Qatar, according to a long, very well researched piece in the FT months plus ago, has spent between $1 and $3 billion, and I think, you know, it's closer to 1 than 3 over the past 2 years, supporting, you know, the opposition and the rebels, etc. Then Iranian assistance is many times that. I mean, you know, when you look in terms of you know, weaponry provided, flights, assistance to the central bank, loan guarantees, personnel, etc. I mean, I think, you know, the Iranian investment is massive. But it shows you one thing, that the Iranians are damn serious about Assad's survival. And, you know, can they afford this? I will let Iran's specialists in the room, you know, discuss whether, you know, the Iranian budget can take that and whether priorities will shift in the short to medium term. But, you know, from an Iranian perspective right now, Iran is making the most out of a bad hand, in a way. I mean, you know, a year ago, all the talk was, of course, the Iranian narrative has been eroded, and the sectarian dimension of the foreign policy has been, you know, made amply clear, etc. But now all the talk is about how you bring Iran into a political solution, and that's yet another card that Iran is going to use. And, you know, they may well see this as an investment. I mean, at least the hardliners in the establishment in Tehran may see that as a worthy investment, not sunk cost. Hezbollah resources, I mean, Hezbollah very clearly as a military organization, I mean, it's a formidable one, but is overstretched. But I think this explains, for instance, why they went in so hard in Luxor, the city southwest of Hamas, that they had retake 3 weeks ago. Hezbollah basically calculates that it has to win quick victories very quickly, even if that means you know, losing a lot in the short term, a lot of fighters, etc. Because the faster you go, you know, the better. You know, they don't want the fight to drag too long, and their objectives, I think, are in line with Assad here. Is that they know where they have to fight and what they have to protect, and they're not going to try to overreach. The question is whether they can deal deadly blow in some specific areas, which they are, and then go with a containment strategy that would cost less. You know, in the medium term, I have no doubt that resources are going to choke Assad in a way, but those dynamics are, you know, the Syrian economy, for instance, survived largely because of influx of money from Syrian expats into the rebels and so on. You know, the economy was kept afloat, and the regime benefited from that. Another issue is, you know, there are a number of examples of regime and rebels making deals on oil, gasoline, other issues, wheat and flour recently. So the regime wants oil and sells gasoline to the rebels, or, you know, exchange or trades and flour and wheat, because so there are local accommodations that, you know, still give Assad some space, some time, some extra space, some extra time to survive.
Okay, we have time for one very brief question before we break. Over to you.
Emile Hokayem at Business Center. I have a question about the change among the countries that are friends of Syria. You saw yesterday or today the change in Qatar, the Emir abdicating for Tamim's son, the problems that Azerbaijan is facing in Turkey. How do you think this affects the opposition in Syria, and how does it affect the assistance, the steadfastness of their friends? Is there any change?
I'm sure we're going to see a headline in Al-Watan in Syria, Syria claiming credit for the change of regime or leader in Qatar. I mean, that's not beyond that to do it. The reality is that the change in Qatar, I don't think is going to have a huge impact on the fundamental structural dynamics when it comes to Syria. Sheikh Tamim was a prime driver of Syria policy, and his probable foreign minister, who has been the person most implicated in all that, Khalid al-Atiyah, was also, is on the same line. I don't think we're going to see a shift at that level. It's more the relative importance of these countries regarding the fight. Certainly, Saudi Arabia has played a more prominent role and in recent times. I think that has a lot to do with personnel changes in Saudi Arabia, but also, a fear that the Saudis were and others were very like the Americans to a large extent measured Assad's survival in terms of weeks and months. And then, the guy has proven a lot more resilient, and they had to revise their strategy. They had to understand that their contacts in Syrian society are not necessarily the most powerful ones. I mean, this is a big problem with the Turks, the Qataris, the Saudis. Is that they somehow believe that the people they talk to somehow are the most important in Syria. And that's, in Washington, it's perhaps the Shalabi syndrome, and, not very, but it's in the same, when Syrian society has profoundly changed, the limits of Turkish knowledge of Syria have been clearly exposed by this. I don't think that, I think Erdogan's domestic troubles are really going to constrain Turkey, but I think Turkey was in a way a bit tired, a bit exhausted in recent times over Syria. I think the Saudis will do what they want to do from the south. They will, mobilize their allies. Military victory is no longer an option, if it ever was an option. The question is, how do you assemble, or how do you strategize in view of a political process or a settlement many years from now? How do you make sure that you still have partners, interlocutors on the ground, many years from now? The game, it's a long game at this point, and Turkish and Saudi and Qatari interests are not going to fundamentally change in that regard. It's still a question of buying influence, leverage. It would be a mistake to focus on the military victories and setbacks and overread those things. We're at the beginning of a long process, and they will remain relevant, and they have the means to stay relevant.
Emile, thank you very much. Copies of the book for sale in the lobby. Emile's talked to me, we want to read it again, so you probably all want to read it for the first time. It's out there. Thank you very much for coming.